Well, guys, it looks like I was wrong. DC Comics is dead. Jim Lee admits it himself. Manga is outselling American comics. At least that's the spin you're going to get from certain comic book outlets. And I wanted to kind of look into the source of all of this, which was an interview from Jim Lee. There's been a lot of chatter about this, a lot of it kind of painting Jim Lee and DC Comics in a pretty negative light, and so I wanted to go to the original source and kind of figure out what my take on this is. I've been overwhelmingly positive about the direction DC is going in over the last year. I have in the past been a little bit more critical about some of the things DC is doing, and even within the last year I've been critical of Jim Lee and his work on Hush 2, but what I'm seeing from this article is not what I think other people are picking out of it. The spin that I've been seeing is that this is Jim Lee admitting that DC Comics currently has no direction, and I'm not coming from this as a blind DC fan. I love DC and I want to see them do better, but I also have been critical of things they've done. I've been critical of Jim Lee and some of the decisions made under his leadership. I've been critical of his work on Hush 2. But I think that in this situation, I feel like the way this story is being spun is just incredibly dishonest, and there may be just a way to discredit the success that DC has been having this year, because yes, they are in the process of being purchased. Warner Brothers is being sold, and some people are kind of using that as a way to discredit the success of what's going on in the comics right now, because for a long time DC Comics were kind of treated like a joke, and in the last year I have been very excited for what I've been seeing, and I've been seeing a genuine effort to listen to fans. That's what Jim is expressing in this article, and even if that's just a way to boost numbers for a potential buyer, I still don't think that makes a difference because people are still buying books. And before I talk a little bit more about the article from Jim Lee, I wanted to jump over here because I found this. This is the top 50 comics of 2025, and I did a little count. I counted about 10 spots that were taken up by other publishers, and most of them were not even cracking the top 20. The Absolute Universe has had its critics and people claiming it's a gimmick, but I mean, the books are selling, and I mean, even more obscure titles like Absolute Green Lantern have made the top 50, which is more of a horror-based story, and that's kind of what we're going to get into with Jim Lee. So I kind of wanted to preface that a little bit with the moves that DC has been making over the last year, and then we're going to look at what Jim Lee is talking about here. And what I'm seeing, I think, is an effort to listen to fans. So, DC Comics president Jim Lee shared his perspective on the global popularity of Japanese manga, citing differences in storytelling, range, readership, and cultural positioning compared to Western comics. And he brings up titles like Demon Slayer and Chainsaw Man that have been getting really popular here in the West, have even had theatrical releases. And according to Lee, manga offers storytelling possibilities that American comics largely lack, noting that the US market remains overwhelmingly dominated by superhero narratives, which account for most sales and readers. So I've kind of seen people spin this as like Jim Lee is just trashing the American comic industry, and that is not what I'm seeing at all. I'm seeing that the comic industry in America used to be a lot more diverse in terms of the genres and the audiences that they were able to tap into. There was a much broader range. He talks about that a little bit here. He pointed to manga's wide range of genres, including stories that explore everyday life, cooking, sports, romance, and countless other themes. And so Jim Lee is not trashing the American comic market. He's not saying that the American comic market is necessarily doomed. What he's saying is that there has been a heavy focus on telling superhero stories. There has been a significant cut in different genres. There used to be a lot more horror comics. Those have been getting more popular recently, but more through stuff like indie. There used to be a lot more westerns, a lot more romance books. I mean, go back to the Silver Age and the Golden Age. Detective mysteries, like bringing Batman back to his detective roots. And that's what I'm seeing DC is attempting to put out in 2026, is a much broader range of stories and from characters that people have been wanting to see. For Jim Lee, I don't think that this is just kind of a PR move to cover up bad sales. I think that this is a genuine effort to listen to what fans want. I mean, we're getting books like Lobo, Etrigan the Demon, and Shadow of the Bat, which is a traditional Batman detective sort of book. And we had Batman Dark Patterns last year, which I think did okay. I mean, it wasn't a top seller by any means. It's more of a B, C tier kind of book, and that's sort of what Shadow of the Bat and Legends of the Dark Knight were, but I think those are some of the best stories for new readers to get into Batman, and I think that that's what Jim Lee is going for, is looking for fresh starts for characters, or, you know, in Batman's case, a style of storytelling that hasn't really been around, that people haven't gotten fatigued of yet. So bringing characters like Lobo and Etrigan, where, yeah, they've been popular, but modern readers haven't really had much to latch onto for these characters. So for a lot of people, they are new. For a lot of people, Supergirl will be their first exposure to Lobo. I think we're even getting a Jonah Hex book, so we're getting a Western, we're getting a Barbara Gordon story, which I think is going to be more of like a cop kind of thing. And I think that also speaks to why the Absolute universe is going so well, because people are excited for something new that they can latch on to. So let's move ahead in the article. He said, I think manga has a distinct advantage over American comics. American comics are almost entirely about superheroes. That is where the sales and the vast majority of the readership are concentrated. Japan's industry is something closer to literature. It's something everyone reads, and it isn't limited to stories about heroes. There are stories about cooking, stories about soccer. There is a much broader range of genres to draw from. And yeah, I think that manga has succeeded because they've been willing to take a chance on some kind of riskier stories that wouldn't happen in the US. He framed manga's success as both a challenge and a learning opportunity, noting that the key issue is not how to imitate manga's art style, but how to understand the sensibilities behind the stories that resonate with readers in Japan. Stories that succeed in the Japanese market, he said, often differ fundamentally from those that succeed in the West. Lee also added that manga and anime are not perceived as media for children in Japan, freeing it from any shackles of being restricted to certain age groups. And I think that's true, that there is a cultural difference between Japan and America in how we perceive comic books and cartoons, and how over there it's just viewed as media, as just literature, and here it's viewed as something a little more for children, or animation for adults is kind of viewed as a little bit more crass. And DC Comics has put out plenty of great animated movies, I'd argue a lot better than some of the stuff coming out in theaters, and unfortunately a lot of that stuff goes unwatched by people who might really enjoy it, just because there is this stigma in the West, and people might see it and assume it's a kid's thing, but a lot of them are definitely not, and that is something I've praised DC for, is not being afraid to sometimes take risks and tell some more adult stories. But I think what Jim Lee wants to do here, and why he did this interview, is because he has a clear plan. And that's kind of the opposite of the spin I'm seeing other people give this, that he has no plan and that DC is cooked after Netflix or Paramount takes over, and that is just not what I'm taking from this at all. I think that he wants to go back to a time in comic book storytelling that is remembered much more fondly than what we're in right now. I'm a bit of a younger person. I was not around through the silver, bronze, copper age, but I have kind of observed how superhero culture has been throughout my life and what I really think has happened to comic books, because if you go back to even the 90s, you'll see DC through Vertigo had a much broader range of titles, and that's something that is coming back soon. DC had a much broader range of books coming out, and I think something really happened in the 2000s in particular with the Spider-Man movie that came out and just the cultural superhero wave that came out of that. I think that the comics became more an accessory to the movies that were coming out, and I think it was around that point when the movies became the first priority and comics became secondary. I think this has only gotten worse with the rise of the MCU, and I think DC completely derailed themselves trying to follow in Marvel's footsteps and taking away from what was important, which was the comics. And right now, I think what I'm reading from Jim Lee is that there is an effort to make the comic books a priority, their own separate priority outside of the movies. I mean, at this point, the MCU has been going on for pushing 20 years, and there's just been a noticeable decline in interest. People aren't going out to see every obscure MCU title. People were hyped when Guardians of the Galaxy came out, and I'd say the majority of people who went to see Guardians of the Galaxy didn't know who those characters were, but there was so much hype around the MCU that people didn't care, and they were just so excited to see anything new in this universe. And I think that that's something that is just not the case. I don't think we could get another Guardians of the Galaxy type of movie where people are excited to see obscure characters for the first time. Of the two MCU movies put out last year, you had Fantastic Four, which already had a bit of a built-in audience, but also already had a few bad movies that people don't particularly remember that fondly. It's already been rebooted once, and so there definitely, I think, is some audience fatigue, and that's an idea we've heard a lot, is that there's superhero fatigue here in the West, and that's why a lot of people like Jim Lee suspect that manga is outselling, and he can remember a time when DC Comics was doing more. So Jim Lee has been following the rise of manga since the 80s, and he started to notice a bit of a rise in the 90s, and he also noted that he is excited for this. He's pleased to see the current level of success, describing it as a benchmark for creators in his industry. He added that if Western comics already had clear answers on how to replicate that success, comparable sales and readership would likely already exist. So I would disagree that this article is Jim Lee signaling bad times for DC Comics. I mean, look at the top 50 comics of last year. And sure, some people can make the argument that these are the amount of issues ordered, not the amount that have actually moved out of the comic shop. But in my experience, I have several comic shops in my area, and DC books have been flying off the shelf, particularly in the last year. I would say it's always been pretty easy for me to find the books that I'm looking for, but it's becoming a lot harder. I mean, you might be able to find a shop that's selling absolute Batman first prints for cover price, but I think at this point it's going to be pretty rare, and I think that's just because people are genuinely excited about what is going on in this universe. So could this just be a move for a potential buyer, or does Jim Lee actually care about Western comics? And I think, of course, Jim Lee cares about Western comics. I think Jim Lee, it would be foolish for him not to care. What I see from Jim Lee is initiative. He sees a gap in the market, and he thinks DC Comics can fill that gap. And as the numbers are showing, it seems to be working. A lot of people, a lot of young people in particular, are excited about the Absolute Universe, and that's going to carry over to DC's other titles. And I'm hopeful that Next Level will bring some of those new readers over to some characters they might not know about, and they get to experience all of that for the first time. And maybe if someone likes the new Etrigan the Demon, they'll want to go out of their way and read Jack Kirby's Demon, and that could be their entryway into Bronze Age comics, into some of the Bronze Age horror stuff, maybe. Now, they still haven't proven themselves yet. The books actually have to be good, or people aren't just going to buy it, but I have a lot of faith. From what I'm hearing from Jim Lee and from other creators, I have my faith, and if I am wrong, I'll come on here and I will admit to being wrong, but I have a lot of faith. I think I'm seeing something that hasn't been this strong in a while, and this has only been the last year. I've told you guys already that I have been feeling like DC has been listening to fans, and I don't think they were for a while. I was very critical of DC for a while. I wasn't really reading a lot of new titles, and that's all been changing within the last 2 years, but particularly the last year. So those are my thoughts on it, and that's my spin on this article. But of course, read it yourself and make your own opinion, don't just blindly follow me. But of course, if anything changes in my opinion, I'll always come out and let you guys know. So thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day. Peace out.